It's time to start our comparison of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 versus 2024 in terms of our FPS numbers. It's a well-known fact that 2020 struggled in this regard due to being single-core limited in many situations. Now, for those unaware, in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, it was very, very bad at spreading its workload across multiple processor cores. Meaning you could be sat there with an 8 or maybe even a 16-core processor, but only one core would really be getting worked hard. This meant that as we started to introduce add-ons such as the Fenix A320, custom airports, and VATSIM with model matching via FSLTL, that single core on our processor had more work to do and hence our performance dropped. With Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, it's claimed that it's much better at spreading its workload out across multiple cores. So our hope in the lead up to 2024 was that perhaps our add-ons won't have such an impact on FPS like they did in 2020. I'm running a 5800 X3D processor from AMD with an nvidia 4080 Super. I'm running 32GB of DDR4 3600 CL16 memory. From Corsair, I'm also running on 4K Ultra-ish settings. So I started from Ultra and I've tweaked a few things down. I generally found that a good place to be. I'll roll these settings across the screen now. And in our 2024 testing today, I've used the same settings, or as close to it as I could get, because there are a few small differences between the two sims. We'll do a separate video on the channel as to which are the best settings for 2024, but in the interest of fairness for this test, I wanted 2020 and 2024 to be running as close to the same graphic settings as possible. So I'm not really running the highest of high-end systems, but nevertheless it is a reasonably high-end PC. Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 always left me wanting more performance, and I was considering purchasing a new CPU, maybe a 9800 X3D to improve things, but I didn't, because with Microsoft Flight Sim 2024 allegedly being multi-threaded, I figured there was a chance that 2024 could give my CPU a new lease of life. So let's dive in and see if these claims of multi-threading are true and see what's what. We are going to start things off with the default Airbus A320neo from iniBuilds at the default version of Gatwick, just to get a baseline using a default plane at a default airport, a best case scenario, if you will. So here you can see we've got footage from Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and you can see we're getting somewhere in the region of 35 to 40 FPS, and we are limited by our main thread. This test is not using frame generation, this is raw performance. In Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, when I enable frame generation, it generally doubles it up. So we'd be getting somewhere around 80 FPS here, as you can see. Moving over to Microsoft Flight Sim 2024, you can see that we're getting a slightly higher FPS numbers as we take the same taxi route, but not by a ton. And it is starting to drop here as we turn the corner back to a similar level to what we saw in 2020. However, what stands out to me is that the sim's built-in FPS counter is now flip-flopping between us being limited by our CPU and our GPU. These tests aren't using frame gen, this is just raw performance. We'll talk about frame gen a little bit more shortly, as it seems to be behaving differently in 2024 compared to how it behaved in 2020. So not really a crazy difference between the two, but if I had to award the prize to one, it would have to go to 2024, albeit barely. What I want to see is how 2024 holds up when we start introducing our add-ons, and that is where things would always fall apart for 2020. So let's introduce our beloved Fenix A320 at the default version of Gatwick and see what that does for our FPS numbers. In 2020, you can see that we're approaching the 40 FPS mark, so not a massive difference between the Fenix and the iniBuilds A320neo at the default version of Gatwick. You'll note though how the FPS numbers in the center of the screen are double that as to what our FPS numbers are on the counter on the right hand side of the screen. That's because in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, the built-in FPS counter on the right cannot count NVIDIA frame generated frames, but MSI Afterburner, seen in the middle, can. One thing to note, however, is that the FPS isn't particularly stable. Look at it here going up and down, bouncing between low to high 30s. Switching over to 2024, and you can see we're still in the mid to high 30s, but look how it's way more stable. None of that bouncing around. And for me, that is a big win, as with Flight Sim, stability is the thing that I want. Important to note that in this 2024 test, we're not running frame generation. That's because, unlike in 2020, in 2024, the built-in FPS counter can count the frames generated from NVIDIA frame generation. So in the interest of being able to compare accurately, I've left it off in 2024. Just to show you though, frame generation does seem to behave differently in 2024. You can see here, sat on the runway at Gatwick without frame generation, we're getting around 40-ish FPS. And I thought when I enabled frame generation, like in 2020, it would double it up, maybe getting us around 80 FPS, but it doesn't. Instead, we're only seeing around 65. And the sim is saying that we're limited by our main thread. So I don't know if a stronger CPU here would allow frame gen to go further. I don't know. I don't have a stronger CPU to test, unfortunately. Throughout all of the tests that we're going to do on this video, I flipped frame generation on in 2024 to see what it would give us. And the behavior that we're seeing here was consistent throughout all of the different tests we did. So at least with my components, we're not seeing a doubling up with frame gen in 2024, but crucially, we are above that all-important 60 FPS threshold. So what happens now if we stay in the Fenix but introduce the handcrafted version of Gatwick from Flightsim.to? This is an awesome piece of scenery, but in 2020 it really did impact our FPS quite a lot. As you can see here in 2020, we're now seeing FPS numbers in the 20s, which, whatever way you slice it, isn't good. And lo and behold, we are limited by our main thread due to Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 being so single core limited. It is not sharing the additional workload with the other CPU cores. FrameGen is doubling us up here in 2020, although with FrameGen, it's most effective when you start from a decent FPS number. Simply accepting, say, 15 FPS from the sim and thinking, oh, well, that's okay because FrameGen will get me to 30, isn't the way to think about things. Yes, technically you'll be getting 30, which should be a totally playable experience, but it's going to feel like a really rubbish 30 FPS experience. Over to 2024 and things are looking much better already. We're seeing performance levels close to what we saw with the default version of Gatwick, mid to high 30s, nice and stable too. Look at that 1% low from MSI Afterburner there, coming in at around 30 FPS. This is very nice indeed. And the built-in FPS counter in the top right seems to be flip-flopping between being CPU and GPU limited. Now, unlike in 2020, FrameGen won't simply double us up. Again, sat here on the runway without FrameGen, we're getting 40. And with FrameGen, we're in the mid to high 60s. So that behavior, like I said, is consistent throughout the range of tests we're going to be doing today. So far, so good for Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. Taxiing around the custom version of Gatwick comfortably above 30 FPS used to be the stuff of dreams in 2020. So this is really, really encouraging. But what about VATSIM? It's well known that landing into a custom airport that's populated with other pilots could really make Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 struggle, as not only is your poor single core having to run the Fenix, the custom airport, but now it has to manage all of those other planes on the ground, and if you're using FSLTL for model matching, which frankly you should be, it has to do all of that as well. So is this where we're going to see things fall apart for 2024 like we did in 2020? Well, to show you, let's start here in Edinburgh in Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 with VATSIM turned off. Now, this is footage I recorded prior to the release of 2024, and you can see here in the Fenix at the custom version of Edinburgh by Pyreegue with VATSIM turned off, we're getting a rather unstable high 20s to mid 30s FPS experience. Not terrible, but also not great. And I particularly disliked how the FPS would be bouncing around like that. Again, with the sim, it's all about stability. That's the goal. Turning VATSIM on and using FSLTL for model matching, you can see our FPS drops, still bouncing around, but the range at which it bounces around has fallen. We're now capping out at around 30 FPS and seeing regular drops into the mid-20s. Again, not ideal in the slightest. Now, at the time of recording my footage for 2024, Edinburgh was completely empty on VATSIM, so I apologise, this won't be an apples to apples comparison, but it will be close. So for our 2024 test, I've spawned us into the handcrafted version of Manchester by Macco Simulations, and similar to what we saw at Gatwick, we're in the mid to high 30s quite consistently in the Fenix, which is a really encouraging start. Though we are yet to enable VATSIM with FSLTL model matching, which is typically what brought 2020 to its knees. So let's turn it on, and oh my goodness, it's not changed a damn thing. Look at that, we're still in the mid to high 30s. I'm genuinely stunned. I assumed we would drop a bit. My hope was that we wouldn't drop as much as we did in 2020, but to see performance pretty much unaffected was not something I expected. And it's busy here at Manchester. Lots of planes taxiing, landing, taking off. This is remarkable. And you can see here as I pan around, the FPS does fluctuate a little bit, which is expected behavior, but we're staying comfortably within the 30s. Hopping into the cockpit and things improve further. We're now getting more like a 40 FPS experience. This is wild in the Fenix at a custom airport with VATSIM and FSLTL enabled. This is seriously impressive stuff. Just for the sake of completeness, let's enable frame generation. And again, just like we saw at Gatwick, not a doubling up like we used to see in 2020, but we're kind of back in that 65-ish range, which is really nice. Perhaps finally the dream of flying around at a reasonably stable 60 FPS, albeit with frame generation, is now a real possibility in 2024. I'm genuinely staggered. Perhaps I don't need a CPU upgrade after all. I'm certainly very glad I didn't jump the gun and spend a load of money. Time will tell though, I suppose. I've done my best to make these tests as accurate as possible, but there's no substitute for using the product over a sustained period of time, like doing our live streams, flying all over the place and seeing how things shake out. So get subbed if you'd like to join us for any of those live streams, and also so you don't miss any future MSFS 2024 content, specifically more performance testing like this as more add-ons start to emerge for Microsoft Flight Sim 2024. But leave us a comment, let us know how you're finding performance in 2024. From my end, it's looking very encouraging right now. Never in my wildest dreams did I think we would see numbers as stable and as unaffected by add-ons as we've seen today. I think it's absolutely remarkable. As you can probably tell, I'm a very, very happy bunny indeed. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, leaving us a like helps the video and the channel a ton. And like I said, get subbed so you don't miss any future content, live streams, and all that good stuff. Thanks very much for watching, folks. Take care of yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, happy flying.